Welcome to the Write the Docs podcast number 17. We are nearly adults. Nearly. We'll have to celebrate our adult birthday party in style in our next episode. Although for Tom, it's still 3 years to go, I suppose. But anyway, we'll get to that later. Let's start with Tom in the past. How are you doing, Tom?
I'm doing great. It's great. It's nice and sunny here. Weather's perfect. It's just a good time of the year.
Okay. And let's zoom into the distant future. How are you, Jared?
Oh, things are going pretty well. Again, it's nice and sunny here in Brisbane. And yeah, job's going well. I'm keeping very busy. And I'm actually doing video production stuff at the moment, which is pretty cool.
Excellent. Excellent. And coming to somewhere in the middle, it is not sunny anymore here in Berlin, but it was during the day. So that's nice. And now I don't actually know quite where you sit in the time zone dance, but welcoming our guest from Ontario, Canada, Mark Baker. How is it in Canada?
It is cold and wet.
Okay, that sounds what I expect.
On the weather.
And we are here talking with Mark Baker on a couple of different subjects, but mostly around his new book. And just before we got started with this, we saw him go to the bookcase. So maybe you can actually just show the book instead of me just telling people what it is. Excellent. I had a fear it was going to be reversed, but just figuring it out. But just to clarify for anyone who didn't quite catch that, it's structured writing, rhetoric, and process. Did you put this out yourself, or is this from?
No, this is XML Press.
Okay, XML Press. And what is that on the front cover?
It's some sort of greenhousey thing. I think it's in Paris somewhere.
Okay.
And if I'd known you were going to ask that, I'd gone and looked it up again. I don't remember.
Oops.
But that's just like it's lots of exposed structure, which is what it's about.
Fair enough. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think is actually I'm going to embarrass myself by saying I don't. Where's rhetoric from? Is that French or France or Greek? Anyway, let's come back to that later.
Pretty sure rhetoric has its origins with the Greeks, right?
Okay.
Like they invented.
Let's steer clear of that subject before we all embarrass ourselves.
I've got no comment.
And that came out just over a month ago, as far as according to Amazon, anyway, September. Yeah,
yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Let's. This is a subject that Tom brought to the table. So maybe let's kick off with Tom and what your interest in this subject is, and then we'll jump into speaking to Mark about it.
Yeah. Well, Mark's last book, Every Page is Page One, has become a mantra that you hear quite often, actually, in a lot of circles. And so this next book, Mark's second book, Structured Writing, Rhetoric and Process, I assume is a topic he's pretty passionate about. And structured writing, I think, it's an incredibly relevant topic for a lot of different reasons. But I'd like to hear Mark kind of tell us why he decided to write a book about this topic. What is it that drew you to structured writing, Mark?
Sure. Well, I've been sort of stumbled into the structured writing industry good 15 years ago or more maybe now. Sort of coming off one of my early tech writing jobs, and we ended up working with a company called OmniMark Technologies, which makes a programming language called OmniMark, which was designed for processing SGML, the precursor to XML. And that language, the XSLT kind of works the same way, but the XSLT isn't in the same league as OmniMark. And so I was working in that environment, and I was doing the docs and doing communications for them. And of course, you use the tools, right? And so we were inventing stuff and playing around with all kinds of ways to use this stuff. And it just kind of stuck. It was like, this is just the right way to do this. And there's been a lot of structured writing systems out there. DocBook, Ditter, Markdown, which is in fact a structured writing system. But I've always felt that all those things missed something really important. that we had worked on way back in the 90s at OmniMark Technologies, and I've sort of taken and used those ideas ever since. But it's been quite a difficult sort of to push against the tide of the big what I call document domain structured writing approaches. And so what I wanted to do, I've been giving presentations and what have you for a very long time, but it's the kind of thing you can't really make the case in an hour, which doesn't bode well for this, but it's 500 pages worth of stuff that needs to be said. And so it was like, okay, write the book. And the book does attempt to look across the spectrum. It's not just about advocacy of one particular approach. It's about looking across the spectrum to show where that approach fits with all the other approaches and what the pros and cons are and what you can do.
But before we jump too far into structured writing, can we start with kind of a definition? Sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Is anybody else hearing that echo? Okay.
I just solved it, but I'll make sure to unmute Mark before we before he answers that question.
Sorry. All right. So Mark, before we get too far into this, you mentioned a few different types of structured writing, but can you give us a basic understanding of exactly what is structured writing? How should people understand what structured writing is?
And sorry, Mark, you will have to unmute yourself. It's slightly strange that I can mute you, but I can't unmute you.
Okay. That's because you're getting the echo from me, right?
Yep.
Defining structured writing. Well, the definition of structured writing has always been a bit contentious because structure comes into it in so many different ways. And you will tend to get people who are advocating for one system or another saying, this is structured writing and everything else isn't, which is just not fair because, look, all writing has structure. You wouldn't understand it if it didn't. It has grammatical structure. It has, paragraph structure. It has rhetorical structure. And anything you do on a computer is expressed in data, and that data has structure, because if it wasn't, again, you just get nonsense. So when you do writing on a computer, you have got the intersection of the rhetorical structure of the content at some level and data structures. So if you take Markdown, for example, Markdown is a structured writing language in that it defines certain rhetorical elements, and it gives them data structures. So you have a way of expressing, this is a heading, this is a paragraph, this is a list. And so those are all structures, rhetorical structures in what I would call the document domain. So they're pieces of a document, and they're expressed in a data structure. So when you take rhetoric and express it in the data structure, you've got that marriage of the two structures happening. And anything on that scale, to me, is a form of structured writing. And if you move along that scale, you're substituting one kind of structure for another, but it's all structured. So it's all structured writing. When you work in Word, you're working in an environment that has certain document elements like paragraphs, headings, tables. If you work in FrameMaker, the same thing. It recognizes some basic structures, and then you put text into those structures.
So can I ask a question here that is possibly playing on anyone who is a little new to this mind? Is what? So in this case, what isn't structured writing?
Well, if you were to take a paint program and you were to use the letter tool in the paint program to put some letters into your raster graphic, right? That to human beings would look like letters, right? The computer would have no idea that they're letters. There is no data structure in a GIF file or a JPEG or a bitmap file that says those are letters. So there's no intersection there between the data structure and the rhetorical structure. If you're writing with a pen on paper, you've got rhetorical structure, but you have no data structure involved. So as soon as you get an intersection of some kind, even the smallest one, between data structures and rhetorical structures, then to me, you're in the realm of structured writing, because there isn't another sort of point where something else happens along that continuum. You simply get into greater and greater overlap between the rhetorical structure and the data structure, where you're capturing more of the rhetoric in a data structure. So if you compared, let's say, Markdown with DocBook, DocBook contains hundreds of elements for all kinds of really detailed parts of a document. So it has elements for bibliographies, and it gets really into what is the structure of a document in a way that Markdown doesn't. But it's doing the same thing. It's creating an intersection between the rhetoric and data structures. And after that, all you're really doing is saying, okay, which rhetorical structures do I want to capture as data? And the reason you capture a rhetorical structure as data is simply so that you can work with it. You can write an algorithm that will do something to it. So if you're working in Markdown, then you are mostly applying styles to it. Right? There's not a lot else you can do. Maybe you can say, okay, this is a level 1 heading, so I can go through that and I can build a table of contents because I know all the level 1 headings I have. But you can't really get in any depth into the rest of the document with an algorithm. And so the more I want algorithms to do, or the specific particular thing I want algorithms to do for me, then I need to express that part of the rhetoric in a way that that the algorithm can get at. And so I express the rhetorical structure in the data structure to support that algorithm.
Okay.
Hey, now, it seems like when you advocate for structured writing, a lot of people immediately think of Ditta and DocBook as like the prime examples of structured writing. But I think that you are hesitant to align yourself with those structured writing groups. Is there any reason, like, do you have any thoughts on the structure that Ditta tries to enforce on writing?
Well, yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of Ditta. It certainly fits in the spectrum, right? It makes content. You put your content into a bunch of data structures so that you can do algorithms on it. And Ditta comes with a whole bunch of algorithms. I mean, their main focus is on content reuse and things like this. And so they have specific structures to support those algorithms. I actually define in the book 4 different domains of structure. The first one being the media domain. So the media domain is concerned with what does stuff look like. So if you're using HTML, let's say, and you put styling directly into the HTML document, that's working in the media domain. You're saying what stuff will look like. If you go to something like pure HTML or Markdown or restructured text, ASCII doc, any of these are all document domain. They define document level objects, and they don't say anything about what they look like. So that's the document domain. Then there is the management domain, which is the management domain is markup you add to content that isn't actually expressing the content itself. It's expressing operations. It's providing either data for management to work on, or it's actually performing a management operation. So in Ditta, for instance, if you put in a conref, conref is an instruction. It's an instruction to the processor that says, when you see me, go over here, get this piece of content and bring it in here and stick it in here. That's an instruction. It's not content. It's a management instruction. And then finally, there is the subject domain, where you are using your markup to say what the content is actually talking about. And you're doing that at a granular level, so that if for instance, you are marking up a recipe, and recipe is one of the big examples I use in the book, because recipes are structured and they're small, so they're great for books. But most books on structured writing in some way or another talk about recipes. But inside a recipe, well, first of all, a subject domain structured writing for a recipe would start with a block around the center, around the middle of it, called recipe. So you're immediately saying, this is the subject matter here. This is not just a document. It's a recipe. Now, you can't do that in Markdown. Markdown has no tag that means this is a recipe. So we're now specific to the subject matter. But you can break that all the way down until the point where you're calling out things like each line of the list of ingredients. You can say, this is the ingredient, this is the unit, this is the value. So this is all very, very specific to the subject matter. And one of the things I try to show in the book is that almost everything you can do with management domain markup, you can actually do just as well with subject domain markup. And not everything, because there are things you do at the management domain level that are just ad hoc and arbitrary, and they're not based on the subject matter. So it's not everything. I tend to the view that if you're working at any kind of scale, you probably don't want to actually do those ad hoc things, because you'll lose track of them. They get very hard to manage. And so, because I prefer to work in the subject domain, whereas Ditter prefers to say, we're going to work in a combination of the document domain plus management domain. That's the core reason I'm not a fan, because I don't like the idea of inserting management functions, management instructions, management data into the content itself.
Yeah.
And I think you can perform most of the same operations with more reliability and more elegance if you use subject domain markup instead. So that's why I'm, not a big fan of the whole Ditter approach. I'm really not a fan of the document domain plus management domain markup approach. And Ditter's just one example of that, and there are other ones. And my core objection is to that model. And going back to the earlier question of why did I write the book, it's because I wanted to be able to illustrate the difference between those two models. And there's just a lot to say. There's a lot of algorithms to go through and show how the two different approaches work. Not to say it doesn't have its applications.
It's actually interesting.
It makes sense, but
sorry,
not a universal.
I just want to follow up one thing there, because it reminds me of some conversations. I don't want to let Jared get a question in. Because I come from more of a coder background actually in the past, and this reminds me a lot of discussions. And I was actually at one of the companies I write for is in the sort of domain-driven development world. And there's a lot of similar discussions in the coding world about how you separate your concerns. And there's older models like models, views, and controllers, and this domain-driven world about how you separate your code bases into either dealing with user function or code function and things like this. And often the gray areas about how you separate these things out is where the conferences happen. But it just reminds me a lot that actually I come from a CMS background, and we also have similar discussions around how you separate things out. And I guess it's an ongoing conversation about the best practices to suit you. But yeah, I have a very, very brief experience with Data, and I never really thought about the aspect of the fact what it mixes. And it does, now you mention it, it feels slightly strange, I suppose. And even having things like includes and stuff, I guess even in flavors of Markdown and stuff, depends on the kind of thing you're writing, I guess. But okay, Jared, do you want to fire off the next question?
Yeah, sure. So I had an idea about what structured writing and every page is page one, mostly in part to a lot of the articles that Tom's written over the years, one going back as far as I think 2012, I think. One of the things that you see a lot at the moment, I know you've touched on this, Mark, is the prevalence of lightweight markup languages, and a lot of folks actually gravitating towards those as the way they're writing. And I always felt that there was a bit of a disconnect with the whole every page is page one and these lightweight markup languages. And I'm just wondering, what I'd love to understand better is, if you are working with these sort of languages, how do you actually adopt an every page is page one approach when you're writing in these sort of languages? Because I think a lot of people might want to get into it, but they might not know how to.
Yeah. One of the things about every page is page one is that it is what I call a bottom-up information architecture. So top-down information architecture says I've got a hierarchy. I've got like my document structure is like a Christmas tree, and all of my topics are ornaments, and they all hang off that at a certain point. But the web isn't like that. The web is not hierarchical, and the best illustration of that is Google versus Yahoo. Yahoo started out as an attempt to build a hierarchical directory of the entire web. And Google came along and said, how about you just have a search box? Because hypertext is like this, right? Hypertext, there is no separation of navigation from content in hypertext, right? The document is where all the navigation lives. Now, you might wrap some document level navigation sort of around the sides, right? But hypertext is really about the links that are in the middle, or at least as much about that. If you go to a Wikipedia page, and you're going to find it's full of links, and you can surf those links. If you're reading something and you come across something you don't understand, when you click on it, you get to another Wikipedia page that explains that. So that's a bottom-up information architecture, and every page is page one is like that simply because that's how people want to navigate. It's how they will navigate even if that's not what you give them. John Carroll proved this back when he was doing it with topics written on individual cards that people would swap around and use in different orders. So we know with a great deal of certainty that's how people want to navigate content. The problem is, how do you organize all that stuff? And we're so used to using hierarchical organization ourselves as creators of content. A lot of people plan by planning a table of contents and then writing the things that go on the table of contents. It's actually quite hard to develop a content set without hanging it around the Christmas tree. And our tools are all designed to work this way as well. So there's an awful lot of content management systems out there that let you write in Markdown, and that's great. It does the separation of concerns from between content and formatting, and that's lovely. But everything in the CMS is still a top-down information architecture. What you need to do bottom-up and do it efficiently is you actually need this subject domain markup in the content, because then you can generate links directly from that. You don't want your writers to be having to go through your entire content set trying to find something to link to all the time. It works on Wikipedia because they have a ton of people doing it for free. It doesn't work in our industry. It would be far too expensive. So there's an application of subject domain markup that lets you, instead of creating a link, simply identify something as a particular subject. Right here, I'm talking about this subject. And then the system can go in the background and it can say, okay, what else is there on that subject I can create a link to? Or I can create categories around, or all of this kind of stuff. I can create lists. With subject domain markup, it is possible to generate your links automatically, to generate your categories automatically, to generate your list pages automatically. And if you can do that, it becomes very much easier to create a bottom-up information architecture. You also get to create all kinds of really useful audit trails, because you can go and say, okay, what are we talking about something in our topics, but we don't have a topic on that subject? Or do we have like 6 topics on this same subject? That's hard to see if your content is all just generically marked up in document markup. But the audit capability you get in subject domain means you can do that kind of thing. So it solves a bunch of management problems. It solves a bunch of content creation problems. And it gives you a better separation of concerns too. I mean, going back to the point about separating the code from the content, because all you're asking writers to do is identify a subject when they mention it. They're an expert on their subjects. They don't necessarily know anything about the mechanism of content management. They don't know what a conref is. A conref is not part of their world unless they're specifically trained to do it. But if you say, every time you mention strawberries, mark it up as an ingredient. Oh, strawberries an ingredient. I understand that. That's in my domain. So, you know, that it achieves a much better separation of concerns as well. So, you know, there's several levels on which working in that domain makes this kind of thing, and particularly makes every page is page 1 easier to do.
So I imagine
I was so interested in it.
Yeah, for sure. This definitely sounds like an interesting approach. So I think the question was, if you're using things like Markdown or ASCII doc or restructure, it sounds like a pathway towards getting that bottom-up architecture going is using heavily using things like metadata tags and things like that in your content, so you can actually get a little bit of that precision in your writing. And I imagine that also keeping your writing on topic and one sort of, not so much one sort of idea per page or per document, but sort of keeping the type of writing that you're doing in that particular file to a particular topic. So you can actually start to get that indexing and that capability to actually find the content more targeted than, say, a monolithic markdown file, for example, with, you know, a whole book in it, which you see sometimes. So that sounds like a pathway towards every page is page 1 or structured writing a little bit more with those markup languages that are so prevalent today.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, as far as metadata is concerned, metadata for basically there tends to be 2 kinds of metadata. One is management domain, right? You're sticking management tags on the content, and the other is subject domain. A lot of metadata is saying, what's the subject of this topic? So you know, you're writing in the document domain and then adding a tag in the subject domain. Whereas if you work in the subject domain to begin with, then you don't need the separate subject domain tag, a metadata tag, because you've already created that metadata. The limit of document domain document plus CMS metadata tag is that the CMS metadata tag can only describe the whole of the document. It can't get down inside it and describe the subject matter of individual fields. So one of the examples of what you can do with this from a content management point of view, let's say you're running a collection of recipes and you have multiple magazines and you want to put these magazines into, you want to put your recipes into all these different magazines that you own. So you have one magazine that's called Wine Weenie, and you want to make sure there's a wine match for every single recipe that goes into Wine Weenie. Now, first of all, if you work in the subject domain, well, then you can stick a requirement into your schema that says you have to specify a wine match. And so, okay, all your recipe writers then make sure they give you a wine match. But then, of course, you acquire a new magazine called the Teetotaler's Trumpet. And, well, you can't have a wine match in the Teetotaler's Trumpet, obviously. So then you say, okay, well, we need a beverage match. We need a non-alcoholic beverage match. Well, you can add another field to your content called, just beverage match, and you can give that a value. So now every recipe has a wine match and it has a beverage match. And then you write two different algorithms, slightly different algorithms, one to build your Wine Weenie stuff and the other to build your Teetotaler's Trumpet stuff. And all they do is they leave out one of these fields. And there's no conditional text involved here. It's just there's a field in your recipe that says wine match, and there's a field in your recipe that says beverage match. Leave out the wine match if you're going to Teetotaler's Trumpet, and vice versa. So you're not asking writers to go in and go, oh, yeah, what's the condition supposed to be and what's the right value for that condition? And we all know how, you get a lot of conditions in content and it's just a rat's nest. But this is very clean. I just say, okay, if you want a wine match, here's one. If you want a beverage match, here it is. But that involves getting the subject matter way down into the subject matter of the content. Can't do that with a metadata label. You can only do that with subject domain structured writing.
Okay. That's a good explanation, I think.
I've got a question. All right. So I think we've started to see on Google, when you search for things like, hey, movie times or weather or stocks or, I don't know, hours, it's able to identify different types of content that are part of that genre. If you search for a recipe online, Google tends to know, oh, this web page contains a recipe, and it will take and extract that recipe and try to put it right in the search results page. So for me, one thing that intrigues me about structured writing is this possibility of making content even more search optimized by telling Google what kind of content it is. If I can say, hey, Google, oh, I shouldn't say that. if I can say to Google, this is help content, this is a documentation type of content, maybe Google will be like, oh, hey, this person is asking a documentation related question. I should try to find documentation types of content to return. I'm curious to know whether you have thoughts on how structured writing fits into SEO and Google's surfacing of content and results pages.
Sure. Well, the sort of the standard way to do that, I'm not quite sure how far we are along in adoption of this, but is microformats in adding that schema.org kind of information to web pages. So that what schema.org is trying to do is to create a standard set of what is subject domain, right? Because the question here is, what is the subject of this content? And the way that works when you apply that to HTML is you get your HTML document structure, and then you have additional attributes on your HTML that are supplying the subject domain identification of the content. So the HTML says this is a list, and the microformat says this is a company name. So you kind of got both going on there. You've got a document domain language with a standardized universal subject domain language sort of laid on top of it so that search engines can get more of the subject matter instead of just trying to guess the subject matter from the content, right? They can actually dig in the same way I've just been talking about and saying, not only is it on this subject, but that little piece is the piece that's on that subject. Now, in terms of creating content, you know, if you start asking writers, well, could you please write the HTML and then add this stuff on top of what you've just done, you're getting into a lot of angle brackets then. So if you work in the subject domain, which then gets translated to the document domain on its way to being published, right? So if you're working in the subject domain, you would have an algorithm that turned that into some document domain language, like DocBook, for instance, or HTML, whatever was appropriate for your publishing process. If you had some sort of schema.org stuff that you wanted to add to your document content so that search engines could find it, well, you're already working in the subject domain, so you can then take your subject domain information and turn that into whatever subject domain information you wanted to pass down the line. And you could do that by simply adopting the standard. You probably don't want to do that because the standard's never going to be as fine-grained as you would want it to be for some of the other things you want to do with it. But if you're talking about subject matter, then any statement that's true about the subject matter is translatable into another statement that's true about the subject matter. As long as you've got the granularity, as long as you're more granular than the standard you're trying to go to, you're fine. That's an easy translation. So you know, I tend to think you want to be talking to your writers using the terms they understand, the level of granularity they're used to, and then you can populate from there. But I mean, this whole thing about the semantic web is essentially about adding subject domain metadata to content. And so my point is simply, well, if you're going to do that, then do it at source. Work in the subject domain, because working in the document domain and then trying to add subject domain metadata afterwards is just a lot more work, a lot more complex, and doesn't do as nearly as good a separation of concerns as if you simply work in the subject domain in the first place and then create all that stuff you need on the other end.
So, in theory, just thinking this through to kind of use cases that personally interest me that Tom slightly alluded to already, even though maybe structured writing comes from some older origins, the more modern uses of taking a single source of information and reusing them in multiple different places for bots, for and this so many screens we have now it's actually a perfect place for a technique that is maybe precedes all of those devices, I guess.
I'm sorry, I lost the last little bit of that.
I just basically saying that we now have a lot of devices that deliver content in different ways and different methods, kind of just trailing off of what Tom just said. So in my mind, structured writing is maybe an older concept, but is experiencing new life again because of this. And whether people are following it, of course, is a whole other thing, but it would make sense if they did.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that's interesting about the multiplication of devices is we've had single sourcing for a long time, right? But most single sourcing has been done in the document domain, which meant that you could take the same document and you could format it for paper, or you could format it for the web. The thing is, there are more rhetorical differences than simply formatting between how the web works and how paper works. You can have links on the web. You can't have links on paper. And so the way that you might want to present the same information on the web and on paper differ more than, you know, what font you want your headings to be in. They differ in substantial ways. No better illustration of this than the way you present a timetable, like a bus schedule, on paper versus how you put it on the web. On paper, you put tables, and people who want to figure out how to get somewhere have got to pull out their tables and say, okay, this bus leaves at this time, and it gets here at this time, so pull out my other schedule, and figure out the connections for themselves. But the way it works online is you tell Google Maps where you want to go, and it tells you what bus stop to be at what time and where to change, and right, and how late the bus is running.
Can I actually just to get into a little bit more, because I must admit I wasn't really quite understanding the difference until you gave those examples of like, so if we want to dig further into something you just said there, like let's take travel information, and let's say you can have travel information, yes, as a series of directions on a map. You could have a static not really a timetable, but maybe like a guidebook maybe that you would read that would tell you kind of more in written form how to get from A to B, but also a voice interface that would say, turn left here, turn right there, walk straight ahead, etc. And so do you feel that kind of current structured writing techniques and systems handle that too, that real nuance kind of differences in delivering the information?
Well, the thing is, if you work in the document domain, what the document domain is doing is it's allowing the writer to determine the presentation, not the formatting, not the appearance, but the presentation, the organization of the content. And that's fine as long as you think the same organization works everywhere I'm going to use this content. But there are all kinds of examples, which, trivial examples in some cases and massive examples in other cases. Try and read a table on your phone, right? So it's, as long as you're working in the document domain, you are preferencing one particular kind of presentation. And if you're trying to deliver that to multiple media where different presentations would be optimal, you're simply not, you're not in the ballpark. So you have to then, if you really want to optimize your presentation for multiple media, multiple devices, multiple capabilities. I mean, different things have different behaviors, right? So you want to optimize for the behavior that you have available. Then you have to take a step back. And as far as you can, if you can work in the subject domain, what you're then doing is creating a repository of information on a subject that you can select from to create a presentation on the fly. So what separating presentation from formatting did in terms of the ability to change what things look like, now separating the presentation from the subject matter lets you change how you present information for different audiences, different devices. You hear a lot about information 4.0 has become the big buzzword, where you want to be able to customize information to an individual device and an individual user on the fly. Well, that means you're determining the presentation. You're determining the selection and presentation of information on the fly. You can't do that in the document domain. The document domain is all about, this is how we're going to present this information to you. So you can't do that kind of stuff. It's all about where you put your stake in the ground, right? In the very first chapter of the book, I talk about the journey that information takes from ideas in the head to dots on a page or on a screen. And if you write with your pen on paper, then you're making marks on a paper and you deliver it to someone, and you're working completely in the media domain. What we're trying to do is get further and further back towards capturing the ideas before we make the decisions about how will we organize it, how will we present it, how will we format it, how will we deliver it. So moving further back, the further back you move along that line, the more options you leave open.
Hey, I got a question. So I would love to try to focus in on very practical tips for somebody who wants to get started doing structured writing. And let me ask if maybe you have thoughts or feedback on an approach I took recently. So in documentation I was working on, it was like catalog elements to describe movies and TV shows. And there were things like, oh, if you've got an episode or it's a series or if it's a movie, you have different tags. And people had to describe all of the, like, imagine Netflix having to describe all of their media. Well, there's a specific structure that they had to follow to do that. Well, for the documentation, we had lots of different unique elements, such as, is this what child elements are allowed? Are these child elements required? Are they optional? Is this tag itself optional, or is it required? Is the tag deprecated? Does it allow certain values? If so, are they Booleans? Are they strings? So I went through and looked, there's probably 75 elements or so, and I made like a little custom schema that said these are the possible values, and way to describe this. Just used like YAML to store all of this catalog information, then wrote a little script in Liquid to iterate through and kind of populate a page. Is that, what do you think of that approach? Is that like using structure in my writing in a good way? Is it inefficient? Could it be more efficient? Can you speak to that, and also just lead into how people do structured writing in their day-to-day life?
Well, congratulations. You've just reinvented XML. But what you just described is exactly what you would do.
I think it's about time. It's about time.
I mean, it's XML schema, right? XML schema is a set of rules about what elements can be where and what their values can be. Now, it's okay. It's okay to reinvent XML. I've reinvented XML too for the book. I have a language that I originally started out wanting to make the examples easier to read, because, as you know, XML is not easy to read. And so I could have created a kind of YAML-like language to do that, and ended up writing the entire book in it. It's now up on GitHub for anybody who wants to play with. It's called SAM, which it stands for Semantic Authoring Markdown or Semantic Authoring Markup, as you please. But yeah, what you described is basically the same thing. XML was simply standardizing the operation that you have just described. In the course of standardizing it, they made it really complicated, which is why it needs to be reinvented. But yeah, I mean, that's what you do. You create a set of rules saying, this is what these subjects are, and this is how you're supposed to describe them, and this is what's required, and this is what's optional, and this is what can repeat. And you create tools to validate that people did that. And you try to give it to them in a syntax that's actually easy to use. And syntax is easy to use depends on who they are, because different people are used to different kinds of syntax, right? But that's it. That's what you do.
I'd like to ask the devil's advocate question. Are there times when structured writing isn't useful or isn't applicable or is too complicated for a particular task?
If there isn't repeatability, there's no point.
Yeah.
This is all about the ability to repeat. I've worked with a lot of organizations over the time, and you're going through like programming manuals and stuff like this, and they tend to just be written in the document domain in FrameMaker or Word or whatever, and people kind of jot down the things they think are important each time, and they are wildly inconsistent. And if you go sit down with them and say, let's put these all up on the wall, let's look for common patterns. Oh, well, we said this here, and then you said that. Maybe I should have said that. But you said it this way, but I think my way's better. And after, people usually start out by saying there's no real structure to this. This is not a recipe. There's no structure here. and go through this for a couple of hours, and they're going, how did we leave so much stuff out? Because you can't see it unless there's a structure. And so, but that's about repeatability. It's about doing the same thing over and over and over again. And it's about repeating, not having to redo the design work. People talk about content reuse. But most of the effort that goes into content is not writing it, it's designing it. It's figuring out what needs to be said and how it needs to be said. And if we can reuse that work, we're going to vastly improve the quality of our content, and we're going to speed up our production, because that's the real thing you want to reuse, is the design work, because that's the hard bit.
So content reuse is not just about the content.
Content reuse, reusing actual content is probably the least beneficial form of reuse, with some exceptions. Okay, there are cases where it can be extremely beneficial, but a lot of people who've adopted it have sort of, after a couple of years, have gone, you know, our content's not really as reusable as we thought. It might actually be if they had gone to the trouble of structuring it so they could see all the similarities. But you do it where there is similarity, and you will have content that is just one-off, and there's no point. You do the design work, you write the content. Essentially, if I do the design work and I want to apply that the same design again and again, then I apply structure.
Jared, do you have any thoughts you want to chip in here?
No, I don't think so at this stage. I think this discussion has been interesting because I think it demystifies a lot of what people might think about like structured writing, and the fact that it's, you know, it could be perceived as quite difficult, when really what you're doing, at least what I've got out of this, is that all you need to do is think about, you need to think about some of those things you would be doing down the track earlier, and then making those decisions up front. And then the path that you lay out based on those decisions becomes a lot easier to start working with. So that's definitely what I got out of all this. And I think that's been really great.
Yeah.
I just want to add.
The thing is, the big structured writing systems that we have right now make it so much more complicated than it needs to be. And that creates this resistance to structured writing that shouldn't be there. But in an attempt to make it universal, they've made it extremely complex. And that's really held it all back.
Or an effort to sell tooling, probably.
Yes.
I'm not going to comment on that.
No, I'm happy to do so. Because I think actually what you said are just about even considering the same processes you go through on each content item is reuse in itself is actually possibly the most useful take home for me, actually. And I have been one of those people that don't think I had much of a use for what I thought of structured writing to me. So that's probably the most beneficial part to me.
Tom,
I
had one little note I just wanted to throw in here. I mean, in this discussion, I would feel bad if we didn't at least mention this, but one of the best applications of structured writing is with the Open API specification when you're documenting an API. I mean, if you have an API to document, you definitely want to use the Open API spec. It's just a structure for describing an API, and it makes it so much easier because it's like you have an approach that's defined. It's like there are fields to complete. There are questions that need to be answered. Is this a Boolean or not? And engineers can do it when they have this structure, at least to some extent. They may populate the whole Open API spec and omit the descriptions, right? But it's like 80% there. And I mean, when it's just a classic example that I think just needs mentioning, because I know we have a lot of like developer doc types in this podcast audience. So anyway.
Well, developers have been doing subject domain structured writing for a very long time. It's called JavaDoc. JavaDoc is a subject domain structured writing language.
Yeah. And also, I've been working with a C# code base that has Doxygen as well, which is somewhat similar. But actually, because one of my questions I wrote in during this interview and now I almost should scratch it out was like any tooling you recommend. But actually, it's probably just a text file or a piece of pen and paper, which most people should have.
Well, you do
begin
need
with.
to be able to transform,
To
right?
begin with, yeah.
You need to be able to transform, and it's very useful if you can validate.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm being slightly facetious, of course.
Yeah.
So, I think I certainly learned a lot. I think we all learned something here. So, aside from the book, how can people find and stay in touch with you the best possible way?
Analecta.com.
Could you spell that?
ANALECTA.com. As in Analects of Confucius. It sort of means stuff that's to be brought together.
Fair enough. Okay. And what's your next book?
I don't know yet. I have something rattling around in the back of my brain about stories all the way down, which is a presentation I've given a few times, because and its essential point, at least in this space, is to argue that people are expecting more from taxonomies than they can possibly deliver, because language ain't as consistent as the taxonomy folk want it to be.
I think that is a good lesson. Okay, let's go forward in time again. Jared, anything you want to mention from the world of the Asia Pacific and how people could stay in touch with you?
Yes, you can reach me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I have a common username on both, which is Jared Morgs. So you can come and follow me in there. I'm even on Instagram if you like pictures of pinball machines being done up. So come and follow me in all those mediums.
Okay. Tom, how can people stay in touch with you and anything you want to mention in your part of the world?
No, I'm happy to be quiet and invisible. So just send me a letter.
I really don't think that describes you, but fair enough. You can find me at Chris Chich on Twitter, and I think at Chris Ward on the Write the Doc Slack. In this part of the world, we actually have, if you're more into the open source world, I will be at Sustain Summit, and I'm hoping that a few people will bring up things like documentation and kind of developer onboarding at that. Next Thursday in London, and then a couple of weeks after that is API the Docs in London. Hopefully, we can have some of those discussions around the structured writing in API format. So it could be quite interesting. Thanks very much again, Mark. If you want to just also find out more about the podcast, you can look on podcast.writethedocs.org. And you can find our contact details. We'd love to hear from anyone who would like to talk and propose a topic. And you can find our previous 16 episodes. So thanks again, Mark, for your time. Good luck with the book. And suggest that anyone drop by to your local friendly bookstore or book site to find a copy, or to XML Press themselves, I guess.
XML Press will give you links to all the places you can find it. Amazon, etc.
Jared, I think you're always best at delivering the final words. If you would like to do the honors, please.
Indeed. Remember, docs, or it didn't happen.